I'm James DeBacco.
I'm Martine Leva.
And I'm Susie Hess. Our Stories Matter podcast was born out of a need for a brave space for people who experience the criminal punishment system to share their truths. This is Our Stories Matter, brought to you by Trauma Informed LA. Our Stories Matter celebrates the complex lived experiences of activists and healers by sharing their inspiring stories. In Season 4 of Our Stories Matter, we will focus on two organizations that are dismantling the 46,000 collateral consequences, Homeboy Industries and Forestry and Fire Recruitment Program.
So today, our special guest is Dr. Dan Siegel from UCLA. Dr. Dan Siegel is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He is also the executive director of the MindSight Institute, which focuses on the development of MindSight, teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel has published extensively for both the professional and lay audiences, with 5 New York Times bestsellers. His newest book, IntraConnected, Me+We, as the integration of self, identity, and belonging, is what we will be discussing today on Our Stories Matter. Dr. Siegel also serves as the founding editor for the Norton Professional Series on interpersonal neurobiology, which currently contains over 80 textbooks. For more information about its educational programs and resources, please visit www.drdansiegel.com and www.mindsightinstitute.com. So now I will turn it over to Susie.
So yes, we are really excited to have you. So thank you again for being with us. And James, do you want to start off with the first question then?
I would. Dr. Siegel, in reading your book, your new book, IntraConnected, Me+We, as the integration of self-identity and belonging, you start with re-envisioning our sense of self from one of the solitude to one of togetherness. From Me to We, as your title indicates, can we start there with what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely, James. Thanks so much for the question. You know, we grow up in a world, first shaped by our relationships with our parents and then other family members. Then we go out into the community. We go to school. We were shaped by our connections with our peers, our teachers, and then we go out in the world. And so we're always shaped by these relational connections. And yet in certain cultures, like the United States, there's a message that who we are, our identity, is separate. Whether that separation is literally you're just in your body and you're separate from other people, or you're a person only with connections to people who are in your family, or people who look like you, or who share your same belief in a religious group or political organization. And these views of kind of who's me, whether it's kind of singular, like I'm just in my body, or even plural, like I'm just people like me, can lead to a deep sense of disconnection and often despair. And you can feel like you don't belong, like you don't fit in. And that despair can lead to all sorts of negative impacts on that individual's well-being, as well as in the relationships that they have. So over time, it became clear that in the United States, at least, and countries that are influenced by the United States, this individualism is associated with a lot of mental distress. We sometimes don't even think of it as coming from the culture, and we say, oh, that person has a problem. But what the problem really is that the culture in many ways is telling us a lie, that who we are is not just individuals. We are both in the body, so fully embodied, and we're fully relational. Our connections with not just people like us, but with all of our human family and with all of nature. So that's captured in the word we. But we don't want to forget that we do have a body that has a history and it has gone through all sorts of things, or it's related to certain people that gave birth to us. And we have that kind of close-up identity lens, if you will, that's a me. So to put them together, to integrate them where you don't lose either one, Me+We is this funny word, we. But what we allows us to do is realize we are a we as much as we are a me, and we're not just a me. That is a lie told in individualistic cultures like the United States that we can now try to move beyond.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure exactly how to pronounce the Me+We. So the we, that sounds even better. So basically, you've taken the collectivism out of it, and you've individualized it and personalized it through individual identity.
Exactly. I got to
awesome.
quote you, James. Can I quote you on that? That's the most elegant way of describing it. I wish I could speak like you. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I appreciate that. Your book is very fascinating and very interesting from a social perspective, and also from the perspective of being one of the disadvantaged citizens from having served nearly 28 years of incarceration. So I really want to appreciate and let you know how much your book really resonates with me.
Well, thank you, James. And, my deepest hope in putting all the time into, constructing that book was that it would be kind of a way of reaching out to all of us. And I really appreciate your feedback about it, the experience it offers is not just ideas, but actually an immersion in a kind of an experience to realize, whoa, together we can actually make this a better world.
Right. I love it. That's awesome. Really great.
Thank you.
Dr. Siegel, that everything you just said is just so important to me. I grew up in a very traumatic, environment, home, neighborhood, and we've heard all the stories of gang neighborhoods and intergenerational trauma, and then having to deal with juvenile halls, jails, and prisons. And one thing I have learned is where trauma lives in my body and my experience, and I love when you talk about the we, because I think that even my work now, working with so many formerly incarcerated individuals, I always use the language of we and us, not you have to do this, not I have to do this, but we, how can we get to this place, and how can we really as a collective support each other, right? And so I think your work is so important at this time in our society, with the ever shifting laws changing and people coming home from prison with so much trauma. But do you think it's possible for society at large to begin thinking of people who have been formerly incarcerated as part of the we?
Yeah, Martine, it's such an important question you're asking. Thank you. It's, if you look at incarceration as an outcome of a deep feeling of not belonging, and that in a way it's an outcome of what the culture has created, then we as a culture can actually transform the way people might think about an incarcerated person, saying, those who are incarcerated are not good or they're bad, and I'm a not incarcerated person, so I'm separate from them, us versus them. So what the we experience and the we notion invites us to do is say, every body, literally, every human body is a manifestation of the same essence. And let me just give you a little example. Like in Utah, there is a forest called Pando Populus. And I was once asked to go there in a bus with 50 religious leaders. And it's not particularly my background, but the person who asked me was a friend. And I said, okay, I'm open to new experiences. So we went there, 50 people on this bus. We get there, and there are 48,000 seemingly separate trees, quaking aspen trees. The formal name is Pando Populus. Well, we met with the park ranger, who told us that 6 inches beneath the surface of the soil was a root ball, and that each of these 48,000 seemingly separate trees are actually just trunks of the same tree. When they tested the DNA, it's the same tree. So it's one of the oldest and largest living organisms on Earth. Well, we were sitting there. We did a little meditation that I did called the Wheel of Awareness. But we were sitting there just reflecting on, we get the image just to talk about humanity, that each of the bodies, now there are 8 billion of us, are all these separate things, separate trees, instead of realizing we are really emerging from a common root ball, and we're just manifestations of the same thing. So when there's the opportunity to say, yes, I do have an individual trunk, but I'm really a part of the common root ball, when people would start feeling that, there's an incredible sense of awe, there's a sense of gratitude, there's a sense of compassion. And those three emotions traditionally in science have been called self-transcendent emotions, but I'm working with the scientists who are actively researching those emotions, saying, let's rename it. So instead of self-transcendent, meaning you're going beyond the self, let's call it self-expanding. So that to get to your question, Martine, so when you meet someone who's been formerly incarcerated, like I'm meeting you guys for the first time. So in me is this incredible feeling of love and deep compassion for what you've been through, what culture created for you, the incarceration you also went through, and now the amazing, courageous work you're doing to say, can I find a different way? And so for me, love is what kind of unites those experiences of awe, where you start feeling like, wow, I'm a little overwhelmed right now, but it's part of something bigger. There's a beautiful book that just came out by Dacher Keltner on awe that I really highly recommend to everyone. But that feeling of expansion, I've been talking to Dacher Keltner about this, that if we could change the way we view the word self, then we would see, and this is to get to the heart of your question, I think, Martine, we would see that that individual who's incarcerated is this individual. That is, we are the same we, right? So then the joining that happens can liberate us from the disconnection that was the origin of the incarceration, I believe. So then it's like, the movement from an individualistic country, which in the United States, we have some of the highest incarceration rates, especially for marginalized people. It's just the whole nightmare of that. If you see it as really the marginalization is the disconnection, right? We dehumanize people in certain outgroups when we say, as the majority white group says, oh, those are the others. The whole thing creates this feeling of disconnection. So the idea of intraconnected is, there's a wholeness, the intra. It's not even just a betweenness. The interconnection is a cool thing. But the word intraconnected is the feeling and the reality that there's a wholeness that we are a part of. And, I'm a physician, and one example of, if there's a cell in the body that begins to act like, hey, I'm an individual, it's me versus the other cells, we call that cancer, and it will kill the overall body. So when you think about humanity or even all of nature as a living being body, then we've got to watch for this disconnection because it's cancerous. And yet it's so embedded in the culture to say the word self means the individual. But what if we say, no, it's self means a center of experience. Sure, you have a body. Let's not deny that. Like James is saying, we're not getting rid of the importance of working your body well, sleeping your body, feeding your body, enjoying your body. So this isn't to go full-on collectivistic. It's an invitation to have more what's called integration, where you have both me and we. And that's where the word we is different from just the word we, because for some people, we loses the me and they push against it. So we says, no, you don't need to get rid of the me. I know there's no word like this in almost any language that we can find on the planet, but how about an idea that there's intra-connected, which is also a word that doesn't exist, where there's a connectedness within the whole, and your individual body doesn't have to disappear as you realize the reality that you're also a we. You're both me and we. How does that sit with you, Martine?
That sits absolutely beautifully. I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about one of my elders from the Santa Ynez Reservation who she used to tell me, be careful with the disconnected one, which he actually mean an individual person, but actually like anything that was disconnected from our ecosystem, our spirit, our traditions, our values, our norms, because the disconnected one is the one always causing the problem, right? It could be, and when you said the cell that is not cooperating, so to speak, is the cancer, right? And the disconnected one is usually the one that's giving the rest of us or the rest of the planet, the rest of the environment a difficult time, right? And so I always try to stay connected to the people, to the planet, to my environment. I stay connected as much as possible because it also keeps me whole too. So everything you said is absolutely beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martine. Thank you.
And as we're talking about connections and interconnections, your book has a strong take, right, on systems perspective and does a deep dive into interconnection. My lived experience is intimate partner violence. And I'm wondering if you can speak on how this lens can benefit how we approach trauma with community members with an incarceration experience, knowing that these systems oppress the collective. And I used to work in domestic violence shelters as someone who experienced it, and I saw that firsthand in the shelters. And now, obviously, within incarceration, I mean, just the entire system obviously is, how this country started. I mean, it was intentional. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. How can we sort of work with this, knowing the systems are oppressive?
Say that last part again, how we can work with it. What?
Yeah, how can we sort of benefit your approach of intraconnectedness, knowing the systems in this country oppress?
Oh, gotcha. Right. So important, Susie. Thank you. As I'm looking at you and seeing the phrase, our stories matter, I think we can begin with that beautiful phrase, the narrative, the story that we tell, because we are storytelling creatures, is so important. And when you get to the part of the story that talks about trauma, whether it's the trauma of, living the lie that the experience of self is only in the individual, that's actually a trauma. It's a violation to what's called epistemic trust, which means, so in philosophy, you have, how things become what they are, that's ontology, and how you come to know what you know is called epistemology, just a word for that. So epistemic trust means you're living like in a family or a neighborhood or a school or, a larger culture, which is supposed to convey to you the truth, but it's actually conveying a lie. So, epistemic trust is really important. And if it's violated, it's a source of trauma that we often don't identify. So the view of the self is just separate, the solo self, is a form of trauma. And when the stories that we tell ourselves inside of these bodies, the story we tell ourselves as families, as a school, as a culture, the stories that we tell, if they assume that statement, the self is the individual, is true, it's going to lead to some really restlessness, because it's actually not only wrong, but it might even be a lethal lie. So then if you start living the story of your life, not just telling the story, but we live out the narratives of our lives, then you can see where, things that would lead to incarceration would happen, because the story is based on a lie. And, to get to interpersonal violence, we could get into the brain if you want to talk about that. But when you look at the structure of the brain, just to say there's a higher thinking part that's part of what's called the cortex, that allows you to reflect on what's going on and create a more fluid, flexible narrative. But beneath the cortex, there are areas that are very old, for mammals, over 200 million years old, but even older, reptilian time, 300 million years old, and intraconnected. I review these systems, but in terms of the systems in the brain, when a person is overwhelmed with three of the main circuits, just to identify, are those of fear, anger, and separation distress, sometimes known as sadness. So if, in terms of interpersonal violence, you're with a partner, a romantic partner, life partner, who isn't, able to coordinate how their cortex feels those intense motivations. The motivation that drives anger is the motivation for empowerment and agency. So just to name that, if someone feels frustrated, you're not listening to me and my agency, which means I'm the source of action, so I'm empowered to make things happen. What's going to come up really fast if they're not more integrated, if you will, or regulated is also a term you could use, is anger. When it's mild, it might be irritation, frustration, anger. When it gets a little more intense, it's rage and fury. So my understanding of domestic violence is it's a fast triggering of this system, this subcortical system. Motivation for agency and empowerment gets frustrated and fury arises, and people are doing something that is really violent. I mean, it's domestic violence. The second system we talked about is that basically of sadness and separation distress. It's really about bonding. You want to be connected. And here there can be a feeling like, oh, I really want to connect to you. I want to bond. I want to be about a relationship. Well, if that is in a larger cultural sense saying, well, you have this color skin, or you're this economic status, or this religious belief, so you don't really belong to the larger culture. This subcortical circuit is going to feel incredible amounts of separation distress, sadness, that can leak over to, I'm not empowered, I'm being dehumanized. It can be angry, or other people could get depressed, But that subcortical system is really important to note, because it's a lifeline for us to belong and bond. And when you're getting messages, well, you don't belong because you're this skin color or something, it's incredibly disruptive to a sense of equilibrium and balance. And then the third system, that's just of many systems that we could go into, but these three I think play a big role in interpersonal violence, why I'm bringing them up, is, the drive for certainty. So this motivation, when it's frustrated, leads to fear, or anticipatory anxiety, or when it's extreme, terror. So if you just think about all the things that can happen in an individual family in terms of attachment, or the larger community in terms of I need to have belonging, so I end up belonging to a gang, or I end up belonging to a religious cult, or these days, there's so much polarization, I belong to some extremist group. And I don't know if you know this, but this past weekend, when I heard this, I could not believe it. There were a number of extremist groups that says, this is the National Day of Hate, and we are going to kill people to express our hatred. And that's our right to do that, I heard, this is on National Public Radio, and I heard this and I went, whoa. I mean, first of all, that a human being would feel that way. Imagine the subcortical drive of anger, and the subcortical drive of fear, and the subcortical drive of this separation distress, when you don't feel like you belong. And then aiming that in a way where, I'll just say this, it was mentioned that I work at the Mindsight Institute. That's just a word, Mindsight, for, have we have insight into ourselves. So that's like making a mindsight map of the inner world. Empathy for others, so we make a map of what's going on inside of the other individual. And then compassion, and kindness, which is basically integration, this idea of honoring differences and promoting linkages. That's a very short summary of that. But just to say that research shows that when people feel threatened, unfortunately, human beings, when you put them in brain scanners, under threat especially, the circuitries of the mindsight mapping areas that say, I'm seeing you, and I know you have a subjective experience that I want to honor and respect. If I see you as the out group and I'm under threat, those two situations, I will shut those circuits off. And at best, I'll just ignore you. But I'm basically dehumanizing you by ignoring you. But if I'm also having these subcortical circuits of anger, I might kill you because you're just a piece of trash in my way. So I had done some work with Elijah Cummings, the congressman from Baltimore, and he wanted me to come to Baltimore and do some work with the racial tensions there, and we did. But one of the issues of many that came up was, what do we do about racism? And when we added the word dehumanization, and I told them these brain findings, these brain studies, it just became so clear that when you're under threat, unfortunately, you're going to intensify this polarization, this racism, and you're going to have some people where they're not awake to this stuff who say, let's have a day of hate and kill some people. And that's how we can understand it. Now, that doesn't give us a path forward to what to do about it. But I just want to put out the truth from the science part to say, for interpersonal violence, there are likely moments in an intimate romantic relationship when one of the partners gets all these subcortical things activated and they see their partner as now in the out group and they do these violent things to them. I don't know how that sits with you, Susie, but and maybe that's too much science for a discussion.
No.
But, I just want to share that view with you, and then we can talk about, okay, what do we do about that?
Oh my gosh. That was so helpful on so many levels. And I think about, too, empathy changes the biology of the brain, which I've always learned from you. And thinking about seeing other as we. And with that change of creating these systems that are oppressive and seeing that there was no option when you think of neurobiology. This is what happens scientifically to the brain. Of course, when I think of what Martine and James, what you both have experienced before you went inside and then coming home, all that. So, the power of empathy and the power, I think, of neurobiology, I really think can change so much.
Yeah, and that's so important to hear. And you mentioned something else in your initial question, Susie, that I want to make sure we just honor. And you talked about how this country has been constructed on these processes. So I just want to name that unfortunately, and this isn't true in other countries, I mean, we should just say it, that, for 400 years, the United States of America has been built on the idea that you go to Africa, kidnap people, treat them as subhuman, and literally construct the infrastructure of the United States based on slavery, and then we don't do anything. And then, even when we ended slavery, we created a kind of, embedded racism that continued to enslave people and dehumanize them and continues to this day. So, we run around like that, acting like it's not really a big deal, but it's 400 years that's been, our history. And the other thing, sadly to say, is that here in the United States, what we call the United States now, I can say I'm living on the unceded lands of the Chumash and the Tongva here in Southern California, and we're the Tongva for Los Angeles. And, the largest genocide that has ever occurred here in Turtle Island. It's the original, this view of this continent. And we run around acting like, the Europeans that came here just were like, let's make a nice country. No, they were going to kill people and enslave people. And so it's kind of like, in terms of cross-generational trauma or just how culture resonates with us, when you're marginalized in the United States, it comes from a long history where, as you say, it was originated with marginalization. And that's a sad truth. But if we keep on ignoring the truth, we're going to have this violation of epistemic trust, and so, there's a lot of work to do. I think it's doable, but if we don't face these facts, and they're not just theories and not just concepts that if we're in a different state of this union, we say we don't teach about this stuff because it's upsetting, these are the facts. And the truth can set you free, even if it's painful to go on that journey.
Yeah, it is painful, but it's worth it. Truly. Your work, my mind is blown right now, just because the work I've put into myself and changing who I am as a formerly incarcerated individual who grew up in a gang, my indigenous practices, and the way you talked about the brain is something I understand with, I want to keep my frontal cortex so I can continue making rational choices. So how do I manage emotions versus control? Because I have no control, but I can learn to manage when anger and sadness and everything comes up. And your work is pivotal in that work. And I really resonate when you bring in indigenous beliefs into the work, because that makes it even more connected to me. And now you're bringing in even the thought, like the enslaved, and how even we have a criminal justice system that's still it's still running off of the same system of the enslavers and the enslaved, and 13th Amendment still continues. But as a man who practices these earth-based spiritualities, this is important to me. You talk about contemplative practices that have been in place for thousands of years, and that we now have science to support them, right? And could you give us some examples? And do you think that these contemplative practices can be just as effective for community members who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated?
Yeah. Thank you, Martine. First of all, to answer the last question first, yes, I do, and I'll explain to you why. And to get to the first part of your reflections, I wanted to really make this as clear as I could in the book IntraConnected, that Indigenous wisdom has been teaching about the importance of relational connections for thousands of years, and that wisdom was cultivated in individual groups that didn't have, a way to communicate with each other. So there's a beautiful short documentary video set called Rooted Messages, and I got permission to transcribe the indigenous elders from all over the planet and what they said about, our connections with one another in the book. And so I want to start with that in the tradition, for example, of the Tongva here in Los Angeles, the teaching was always about our belonging to community and our belonging to nature. So indigenous wisdom from different indigenous groups share a common ground. And when it's come from in an independent way, we use this funny word called consilience. But there's a beautiful consilience among indigenous teachings, even though they brought up independently. So that's a fascinating finding. Then in the contemplative traditions, which contemplative means reflection practices, like meditation would be an example of one. We hear the word mindfulness or mindful awareness, and we have a center at UCLA that I helped start called the Mindful Awareness Research Center. And those traditions, contemplative traditions, in the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, those are the formal ones, and there are informal ones as well. They also have come, when you look deeply at their teachings for thousands of years, to also similar conclusions. One of those conclusions is be wary of the mind's view of the self as separate. So that's kind of cool. So they've been teaching this idea of let's expand what we mean by self. They say it in sometimes extreme ways, like there is no self. But when you really listen deeply, there is a kind of a relative self or private self. They just say, let's not think that that's the only self. That's really, in a deep way, what the deep teaching is across different contemplative traditions. So for me as a clinician and a scientist and a person in the world, I just became really fascinated with these consilient findings from indigenous scholars and indigenous stories about what the world is comprised of, and contemplative teachings, which were also done for thousands of years independently. And I thought to myself, also trained as a scientist, what might science add to these conversations that have been going on for thousands of years? But at the same time, certain cultures, we'll call them modern cultures, including the United States and much of Europe, have just completely ignored them, or worse, obliterated them. I mean, literally killed the people who teach them. So as a scientist, what I wanted to do is say, okay, let's look at what the indigenous teachings are. Let's look at what the contemplative teachings are. Now, is there a science in modern times that actually can be used to either support them or say, yeah, there's nothing to them? But it turns out, like you're pointing out, Martine, there's a tremendous amount that now supports, for example, in contemplative practices, how taking a few minutes a day to reflect by sensing what's going on and not just living on what could be called automatic pilot, actually, as you're pointing out, activates regions of your brain so that as they're activated, you can, and gets to a deep view of what the mind is, but you can monitor what's going on in a more clear, in-depth, focused, detail-based way. So you basically become more aware of what's happening. And number two, you can modify it. So those two things are like how you regulate something. Like if you ride a bicycle, you got to monitor where you're going with your eyes, the balance of the bike and stuff. But then you got to be able to modify it by steering in a different direction or pressing on the brakes, or pedaling harder. And basically anything that regulates anything, like riding a bike, means you have to do those two things. You got to monitor and modify, or sense it and shape it, or track it and transform it, whatever letters you like. So what a reflective practice does, in my point of view, this isn't necessarily how the contemplative practices themselves would summarize what they do, but as an outsider to them, because that's not my area of background, I think what they're doing is strengthening both those capacities. They strengthen your ability to monitor what's happening. So now you get a pause before acting on an impulse, for example. Why? Because basically where attention goes, and that's what you're doing in a contemplative practice, is you're focusing attention a certain way. Where attention goes, neural firing flows. So you're actually using your mind's attention to get the brain to get active. Now, why is that important? Well, you're not only creating a state in the moment, but where attention goes, neural firing flows. And here's the key: neural connection grows. So when you're doing a contemplative practice, you're not just having, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, of kind of a calm, clear state, which is cool by itself. But you're actually, just like you work out a muscle, you're actually strengthening that muscle when you do your workout. So it's like a brain workout, to do contemplative practices. And what's it strengthening? It's strengthening the two things I mentioned. You can monitor with more stability, so you see with more depth, clarity, and detail. And that monitoring, literally, if you look at the brain, gives you the ability to pause. So you can say, I'm so angry right now, I have an impulse to punch this guy. But when you have this more spacious awareness, you're able to hold it in the monitoring thing and say, I think punching him now is not such a good idea for me, for him, or for anybody. So I choose with this consciousness not to punch him. Now that's called emotional intelligence. And what it means is you are literally allowing choice to enter the picture now. It's the opposite of automatic pilot. So a human being on the outside can look exactly the same, but someone who's done a little bit of contemplative practice, what they're doing is they're gaining the freedom and the strength of the pause. Pause. I have a dog here, so it's not the pause of a dog, but the strength of the pause, And so now that's the monitoring ability. Then you say, well, you're also changing the ability to say, I am now modifying my impulse to pulse to punch someone. I'm going to now learn techniques, for example, of communicating how I'm feeling and connecting with people through questions and a compassionate kind of inquiry that allows the whole interaction to be different than turning into a fight where one of us gets seriously hurt, one of us gets incarcerated after that. I mean, it's like a lose-lose situation. So, what we do is with contemplation, and that word maybe is, I know it's the word that's used, and people sometimes freak out a little bit like, you're going to make me religious or something. And it's not saying anything about religion this way or that way, but religion sometimes can divide us. What these reflective practices do is they unite us. They allow you to come to realize that you are not just a separate self in a body, that you are deeply connected, And with Elijah Cummings, for example, we had people who were white and people who were black in the same room. There was so much tension. We did this contemplative practice called the Wheel of Awareness, which you can do on my website. And, people drop into pure awareness. And there, the sense of separateness begins to dissolve away. So you realize those human beings you used to, a few minutes ago, think were in the out group, you realize they're just an expression of the same essence. And I have an acronym COAL that you can change to mean your connection to that person is different, the open awareness you experience, and the L, the love. Because it's almost as if, that love actually feels like, after doing this with tens of thousands of people, it feels like it's a thread of a tapestry of life. And when people start getting into violence and start getting dehumanized, the love is extracted from their lives, and yet we can live a different kind of way. And I think this is what contemplative practices allow us to do, to monitor and to modify toward love, basically.
Yeah, your work is so, my mind's just blown right now, because I feel like everything that I've done in the last 20 years, including the last 15 years being out of prison, like everything you talk about, and it just validated all the work I've done, because I've been able to deal with some big high levels, like when my mom died, when all my elders have passed away, like so many big things that happened in my life. And my brain used to be like anger, drugs, violence. And now when these big, knowing this work, like I'm a testament of it, because this work now tells me that when those big things happened, my mind didn't go there. My mind went to like peace, love, self-acceptance, understand how to connect with others, how to ask for help, how to seek the resources I needed. And this is all the rewiring of my brain. And so I thank you for this work, and how I just feel validated, like what I'm doing is actually being done correctly. So thank you so much for that. Thank you.
You're absolutely welcome.
Dr. Siegel, yeah, I mean, you are so fascinating to listen to, and just, and have this communication and to be engaged with, and one of the things, when you start talking about contemplative practices, one of the things that comes into my mind is Thich Nhat Hanh, and, his message is be free where you are, and the identity of self and no self, and it just takes me right back to the areas of your book IntraConnected, where you talk about subjective, perspective, and agency as the three things in terms of the self. So this is part of the journey of the book to move from self to a more expanded sense. So what does that look like to you? So tell us more about that, and how does community members who have been incarcerated, as well as the allies, how can they put that into practice?
Yeah. Thank you, James. Yeah, that's a really great question. When I was on the journey of these things coming up, the awareness that lack of belonging might be a deep source of incredible despair that could lead to incarceration, that could lead to racism, that can lead to, polarization, that could lead even to environmental destruction. All those serious issues, that lead to so much suffering. When it started becoming clear that it might just be a common root, that this view of the self as separate might be beneath all those things that seem like they're different. I went on a journey, to say, okay, well, what in the world is this four-letter word self? What, is it just the individual like we're told in this culture? And then when it became clear from the science of people who were talking about self that even though they were all saying different things, there was a common ground, a consilience, this common finding, even though they were doing it in independent ways, that involved these three things you're pointing out. And I'm kind of an acronym nut. So, I like to remember things with acronyms. So the acronym is a way to remember something more effectively in a single word. So it's the acronym SPA, S-P-A. And when I looked at the science of self, it said that people say, well, what does it feel like to be James? And now you could say, well, that's a sensation, right? That's a subjective experience. No one else but James can know it. And you could say, sure, okay, so that's S, that's the subjective sense of something. Okay, then there's looking through James's glasses, right? So the perspective, you'd say, well, if I were James, then I would see the world from this point of view. So that's the P. And then there was agency. How do you act on behalf of James, in the sense of the self of James? Well, that's pretty straightforward to talk about the individual. But then what started happening inside of, this body called Dan, was the experience in this Pando-populous forest where you could have on the surface a view that these are 48,000 separate trees. But actually, if you just go a little bit beneath the surface of the soil, you go, whoa, it's one root ball. If you go a little bit of a study of each tree, you realize the DNA shows it's the same tree. So then I thought, okay, well...
Right, it's like the tree of life that you're talking about.
It's definitely like the tree of life,
Yeah, it's all existence.
It's all existence, exactly. Yet we get the illusion that there's 48,000 separate things, just like we could say James is only that body right there. So then you go, or I went, well, maybe this is not a conversation worth having. Maybe just drop it. Just say self is the same as the individual, and that's just the way it is. But it was nagging at me like, no, it's probably worth a conversation. Just like years ago, I tried on this, this journey to say the mind is not just the same as brain activity. And that got so many people agitated, but I stuck with it over 30 years, and it seems to have been a productive thing to push against. Mind is not a synonym, a word that just means the actions of the brain or the structure of the brain. It's not. It includes the brain, but it's much broader than the brain, and it's bigger even than the body. But that's a different discussion. So with the self thing, when I said it was a SPA, I started saying, could you have a subjective sense, the S, a perspective, the P, and an action, the agency, on behalf of, let's say, a one-on-one relationship? And then I said, well, yeah. I mean, I do couples therapy all the time. I'm in a almost 40-year marriage, and there's definitely a we between my wife and myself. And sure, she has a body, I have a body, but there is a self of our relationship. So I said, whoa, what are you saying? And I said to myself, in this body, I said, well, there you go. So at least in the immediacy of a pair, there's a subjective sense, the S, the perspective, a P, and an A, an agency. And then I just did an exercise to say, well, could I expand this to my whole family? Yeah. Could I do it with my friends? Yeah. Could I do it with my neighbors? Yeah. You could do all of that, where then you were with all of human beings, 8 billion of us, and then even all of nature. So I said, okay, so self, if self is spa, then self is not limited by skull or skin. And that's where I said, okay, well, then it's kind of like an identity lens. So I made up that term, identity lens, to say, just like you can have a camera and you're focusing on, like, a branch of one of those trees, you go, oh, cool, I'll get to the leaf of the tree, But then you could widen the angle of that lens. So you see the whole tree, not just the leaf. And then you widen and you see all of the trunks, and then widen and see all of the planet or whatever. So then I realized, okay, well, people know about cameras usually, so let's call it a lens. And let's just say it's an identity lens. So what if we were to start teaching young children and adolescents and even us older people, adults, what if we named it identity lens and said it's the spa of the body, the immediate relationships, and just go out and out. And then I started doing exercises and workshops, and people really got it. And
yeah,
they
it's
were
really
like,
brilliant.
Yeah.
The concept is just brilliant.
So thank you. And how does it sit with you, James, that kind of view that self is, has these layers to it that you can access with a lens?
Well, I'm very partial to what you're saying because, I'm married as well. And so when I start thinking about the different lenses within a marriage and then within a family, I'm able to identify the we in all of the identity of self. So the self is not so self-contained because it's a we aspect of it. And that's what I really appreciate in being able to understand your theoretical principles and on how the brain emphasizes this type of structuring. So I'm just really grateful and appreciative of you coming on and just sharing that with us.
Well, I love that, James. I am grateful for you as well, and for Martine and Susie and all of us listening. When I hear you speak like that, what's so, of the many, many things that's so exciting is in the individual, we've got a brain, and the brain learns from experience. So if your family unintentionally keeps on telling you the self is only in your body, or if the culture, when you get to school and then out in the larger world, tells you yourself is only in the body, that construction of a self is learned by your brain. So what we're kind of saying here is that, whoops, that's wrong.
Yep.
And so instead of beating ourselves up, what if we just said, we got it wrong? And I have a dear, dear friend who's about to turn 94, Joanna Macy. She's written some beautiful books. One is called Active Hope. And at 93, she just came out with its second edition. Anyway, Joanna, and I were talking about this the other day. And the idea is, that Joanna has coined is this term great turning. And the great turning is a phrase from Joanna Macy that says, what if we could turn our consciousness in a certain way to start living in a much more compassionate, connected, collaborative way? So part of what I wanted IntraConnected to be is like a gift to Joanna to say, something, here's the science. And it's just what you said, James, where we can say, okay, we didn't know that what we were told was a lie, and in fact, a lethal lie, but it really matters. And if we take a common word like self and just say, hey, you have an identity lens that changes how close up you view what this self is. Sure, you've got a body. Let's not ignore that. Let's not go away from there is an individual self, but let's expand it to look at all these layers of relationality that are also things you can act upon. That's the agency. You can have a perspective of, and you can sense into. And this is where, Susie, you brought it up earlier, this is the system sensing, in what's called system science. We have things called system sensing, systems awareness, systems thinking, systems intelligence. This systems way of living is very different from the individualistic way of living, where you go, it's just about me, 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 me. So this is where, the funny word "we" came up. I was giving a lecture called Me+We, which I thought was kind of fun because it rhymed and everything. And one of my students said, that really pisses me off. I said, well, what do you mean? What pisses you off? She goes, your title is you're a hypocrite. I said, well, how am I a hypocrite? She goes, me to we implies getting rid of me and going only to we. I said, you know something? You are absolutely right. She goes, change the name. I said, well, how about not only me, but in addition, the integrated we? She goes, well, that's too clunky. Make it shorter. I said, okay, well, if you're going to integrate me and we, integration is where you differentiate on the one hand and then link on the other. But in the linkage, you don't lose the differentiation. So it's not like blending. This is really crucial. Integration is things being different or differentiated and then linked. And in the linkage, you don't lose the differences. So I said to her, I guess it would be like me and we is we. And she goes, that's it. You know, and it was really simple, you know.
I love it.
But that's where it came from. Yeah.
I love that so much. And, you know, a final question. I mean, we can talk with you all day or actually listen to you all day. We're all three like super just entrenched. How do you think, like your sort of final thoughts, how do you think life would look different if we all incorporated we?
Yeah. You know, it's so funny, just a teeny background. In IntraConnected, it went through so many different versions, but one of the versions was a fictional account of a person named Sam, and you see Sam being conceived and then being born, and it turned out to be a 300-page rhyming fictional account of exactly what you're talking about, Susie. What if we could live a world as we? And in that world, it's a very different world because, listen, we are incredibly creative, compassionate, collaborative beings. And there's a liberation when truth is how we live, right? And the liberation is that who you are is not just that body and what you experience. And the rhyming book never made it anywhere, but it was certainly a fun thing to write. And I don't know why it came out in a rhyme, but what you learn in that experience, and it was the basis of the IntraConnected final book, actually, the structure of it. What I learned in writing and seeing what happened with Sam was that there was incredible freedom to start doing what now research is really clear. When you act on behalf of what we call the other person, you actually, in your individual experience, become happier and healthier. So when people feel hopeless, get active, reaching out to connect with what we call others. Now, I'm nervous about using the word others because this whole discussion is about they're not really others. So it's clunky in English, but you could say something like people who are not born into your body, you know, or say, but you could say other people, just, you know, that would work, other individuals. So what we do then is you say there is a way to work together, starting like, let's say, the four of us now and anyone listening to us, there is a way to say we have what's called pervasive leadership, which means every individual on this planet can be empowered with the knowledge and the skills. Let's just start with the identity lens business to learn that they have an identity lens, that we've been told a lie in modern culture that the self is just the same as the individual, and that's just not true, and that you learn to adjust this identity lens. When people start experiencing the joy and the fullness from belonging that comes when you reach out and connect with, you know, people in other bodies. I don't know how to say it. Maybe you guys can come up with a better way to say it. You know, that are you, you know, that they're part of the we, you know, it will start positively creating this positive feedback loop where people realize, I feel better when I realize I'm not just in this body alone. I feel better when that's there. Why? Because love is actually the vital force of the universe. And all these constrictions that we see of polarization, racism, destroying the planet, come from this lack of really tapping into this love. It's all about linkage, you know? And so it's a world that will take care of itself, I think, once we get to the truth. And then we don't have to be like in charge of making it happen. It's almost like you let love happen and these positive things can emerge if we can dedicate ourselves to living a life of truth, which is that the self is not separate and that it's not just about me or even losing the me for only we. It's this we interconnected identity.
Oh my gosh, that is beautiful. Thank you so much. I love. I mean, that's the answer. the answer of love and the interconnectedness of all of us. I mean, yeah, you definitely changed my morning and probably life just in this hour. I'm so grateful, Dr. Siegel, for you being here and sharing your heartbeat with us.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Martine. Thank you, James. It's an honor to be here with you, and we can do this, and we have a path to do this together.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Siegel. It's been a beautiful morning for me as well. Beautiful morning.
Very, very exciting for me as well, Dr. Siegel, and just an honor and privilege just to hear you and just listen to your mind. A great, beautiful mind, and I'm just so privileged right now to be right here, just listening to you and being with my co-hosts, and having the opportunity to talk with you and just really engage in conversation with you. So thank you very much.
An honor, an absolute honor. Thank you all, and to be continued.
Yes, please.
Our Stories Matter is brought to you by Trauma Informed Los Angeles. We want to thank Homeboy Industries and the Forestry and Fire Recruitment Program for sharing their experiences and opening their doors and hearts to us. Thank you also to Fabian Deborah for allowing us to record at Homeboy's Art Academy. Thank you also to the University of Southern California Good Neighbors, and thank you to Yehuda Price for composing our original music while incarcerated. Thank you, Ivan Reyes, our amazing editor. Please consider giving us a review with a 5-star shout out. Subscribe to Our Stories Matter wherever you get your podcasts. Join our Trauma Informed Los Angeles community at traumainformedla.org. Please go to our website to read the full bios and credits. Join us next week and stay tuned for more Our Stories Matter.
We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the original stewards of the land where our event takes place today. Trauma Informed Los Angeles acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of the Tavangar, which today is the Los Angeles Basin and Channel Islands. We are committed to uplifting the names and community members of these lands and across the nation who reside alongside us. We also want to acknowledge the suffering and forced unpaid labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans, which enabled the start of this country.